So I'm going to use the context of city skylines as a way to explain a few things about how governments work. City skylines is a pretty interesting way to show that because of just all the attention that the developer ended up putting into this game. It is a game that is focused in land use decisions in a city, and I think that really makes it very interesting for just explaining how it works. Just gonna wait to see if there's anyone else that's gonna jump on, and then I'll get going. But in the meantime, I'm going to show some things. Electricity is something that is, of course, a consideration. Then you've got water, getting water and heat over. Garbage is always an important thing in any urban setting. With health and whatnot. So first off, I want to start by saying, obviously, things don't happen immediately like in city skylines. Local governments are usually based in there are usually two types of government. There's a strong mayor form of government and a city manager form of government, and it's going to vary based on the part of the country you're in. I'm based in Arizona. We have a city manager form of government. In the city context, which means that a city council or the equivalent in your area might be a borough council, whatnot, would end up selecting someone who they actually appoint, who is not a politician per se, to actually run their city. And then we've got mayors in other areas who are directly elected by the people who run the executive branch. And so a lot of decision making really goes through the council, or the city council, or the equivalent, being the board of supervisors for any type of county. And so things can get really worked up after a while. They're not immediate things that can be done. So let's kind of look at a few things first. I guess I'll start by explaining electricity. So in this game, you are always trying to build to make sure you have the utility services are available to the public. So you start with simple power lines. You kind of go to wind turbines, go up to coal power plants, oil, hydro, solar, and you kind of keep going up. So this is actually a city I put together in the game. I guess I need to just I'll have it on pause for now. But there are different ways you can do that in a real local government. One, the government can actually provide the utility service, and put down lines everywhere and whatnot. Or you can have a private entity, a private water company, electric company actually provide that service. In this game, when you kind of build up, you start by really just putting up windmills and things like that. Power lines are actually kind of interesting because they're different voltages. So under federal telecommunications law, it is something that you got to be cognizant of because different lines have different requirements. So you have your overground lines, and then you can potentially even have underground lines for safety reasons for the public. But in the context of city skylines, what we're doing is making sure everyone has power, and power can jump buildings and whatnot. So you don't always have to have lines in city skylines for that. But it gets tricky because with electricity, you have an issue where it implicates a lot of property rights. So the private property rights are kind of factored in. These utility companies got to make sure they get access across various properties. So in this case, I'm trying to produce in city skylines a lot of electricity. The tricky parts being you got to make sure you get electricity to place, a little more rural places. There's not a lot of buildup, so as they kind of make a point of in city skylines, you're trying to really build for electricity to move from building to building. So you need for greater distances transfer of electricity through power lines. Going to water and sewer, in my particular region, it's actually one jurisdiction providing water, the other providing sewage. Obviously, with environmental issues, you want to have your, as you can see here, I have where I'm getting the water, where I'm pumping the water, to be way upstream from the sewage lines that kind of drain downstream. Obviously, you don't want water to, you don't want effluent, and that's the term for wastewater, to be something that is upstream and then it gets in people's water. And so there are treatment, plants that really go into that. And with wastewater, it's one of those things where with a government overseeing that, they want to make sure that companies in the area that are dealing with wastewater, where there's restaurants, car washes, that sort of thing, are doing so appropriately. So certain kind of minerals, like there might be too much zinc or sulfide and whatnot, don't get into people's water supply. That's really the gist of it. So in the game itself, it's kind of interesting because you can build out your water. So your blue line is your water, green is your sewage, and there's also a heating aspect in the DLC, which allows you to provide heat. Now, so the lines kind of run together, just for simplicity's sake. You're able to do that, but the idea being you want to kind of have your water pipes upstream. You got to have it sewer downstream. With that comes utility hookups when local governments work on it. For example, a private developer might build out sewer lines, or they would build out a sewer line, then the utility company or the government who actually runs the service will actually take control of that, as part of providing that service, and there's generally agreements that go into that process. Heating, obviously, very important in this, in the winter. So you got various types of water towers and water drain pipes, and the equivalent for sewer, for that, to achieve that purpose. So looking at garbage, one of those things we don't really think about too much are landfills. And landfills, in this context of a city, I try to put them all out in one area so that you don't have any ground contamination. That ground contamination, of course, is something that people are pretty concerned about. Governments certainly are. There's potential environmental liability, and of course, health hazards if you put it too close to where people are living and using the land. So that's why, in this context, you kind of want to put it in a special area. Incineration plants in this game can be useful as well, but really landfills are kind of a little simpler to use, right? So I tend to, in city skylines build-outs, this being the biggest city I've ever built, I try to put it in areas that are away from people. So I have it kind of separated out in terms of the freeway system. Garbage produces pollution. You want to put it away from residential areas, is how it's explained, right? Education is kind of the next tab as we go down the list. We have elementary, high schools, universities, public libraries. So local governments aren't usually the ones that specifically, and I'm talking about county and municipal governments, they're usually not the ones who actually run schools, obviously, but there's still an impact because the school districts that collect property taxes from taxpayers in order to provide education for people in the school district, I mean, there's going to be some interplay because county treasurer's offices end up collecting the taxes for them. They distribute it, so there's kind of that county implication there. And from cities, well, obviously, if there's any, crime that happens or violence that happens at schools, who's going to really be the ones who respond? It's going to be police departments and from, the local city generally. So in this game, I try to put schools everywhere. Elementary schools are basically all over the place. And I know in your local community, there are probably many, many elementary schools. So in this game, it reflects that. I have one in basically every kind of community you can see. Same thing with high schools, not quite as many. A few universities here and there. You want to make sure places are covered in terms of getting, higher education through community colleges or even a big university. And then public libraries. I hadn't built as many out for this, but I would if I had a little more money to do so. Libraries are something that generally are run by your local government, even if there may be an alternate source of taxes going into it through, say, like a special taxing district, like a library district, to collect monies for that. Libraries also, of course, they're able to get donations from the public to provide, for educational expenses and whatnot. And you have the issues that really come up with First Amendment issues. There are all types of weird First Amendment issues that can come up in public libraries. What can you do? What can't you do? Certainly there's a lot of things you can do in the library. So kind of want to make that across the board so that people generally that may have a little less access to educational resources get that opportunity, because everyone else probably can buy things off Amazon. So city happiness in this game is just kind of interesting. It's a general factor, obviously. There's no such 89% residential happiness, but the idea being when you are, you want people to be happy in all sorts of areas. Going down to health, in this game, I'm putting various facilities around so people have access to it. The challenge, of course, with the local government interplay, whether it's a city or a county or whatnot, is you want it to be close in terms of access, so that with things that happen that first responders respond.
Packaging specialists are proud to present.
What is this ad? Let's listen to it.
Your houses. The untold story of the invention of the box and the family rivalry that nearly destroyed it. It's a tale about opening your heart, finding acceptance, and inventing the most efficient means of shipping and packaging that mankind has ever known. Proving that to find what's in your soul, you have to look outside the box and into another box, which is a house, your home. And that truly is the greatest box of all. Tune in every Wednesday at 8 for this once-in-a-week time television event, A Box on Both Your Houses, presented by Square Packages, the packaging specialists.
Bring the whole family to At the Old Grain Mill, old-fashioned family restaurant. At the Old Grain Mill always has the best service and the best home-style meals in town. We'll make sure you always leave At the Old Grain Mill with a smile and a full belly. Now, be sure that you come down to At the Old Grain Mill, old-fashioned family restaurant, and not the abandoned grain facility at the edge of town. It's not safe for visitors and poses serious risks to anyone who dares enter that old mill, which was forced to close down years ago. We ordered our sign and uniforms before we learned of the existence of that dangerous old flour mill, so we are not responsible for what happened there on that awful night. We just want to focus on making great meals every night at the Old Grain Mill, old-fashioned family restaurant. At the Old Grain Mill, from our family to yours.
Thank you, Mars Radio, for the
This is Mars
insightful.
official radio with Panem Escalin. One of all the letters we received today comes from Earth, from my old astrophysics professor, Aldous Lincoln. Dear Panem, I am delighted to hear that you're working on Mars. It must be fascinating. You will inspire your listeners to examine thrilling realms across space, time, and matter. You are always welcome to a full-time position on the faculty here if you ever return to Earth. Take care, my friend. Love always. Dear Professor Lincoln, I don't know what to say. Please roll the next song.
All right, thanks for the Insight Mars Radio, people. So I'm going to go back into the health aspect of it. Having proximity is kind of a big deal for any local government who has first responders respond to, things that happen. People get attacked, people have heart attacks, things like that, and you want to have access that is as close as you can in terms of healthcare and whatnot. And it's actually kind of interesting in this game because you also have death care, so you have cemeteries, and I try to put that in every which way so that that gets taken care of as well. But from a local perspective, and I think this is a good transition into fire and police, right? So there can be two ways that fire services can be provided. It's usually through a fire department in a municipality. In a county, you're going to go to usually, county fund. So there usually be special taxing districts that are fire districts. So you may have a local fire district charged specifically for fire services that are provided. Kind of an interesting arrangement there that comes with that. Again, like with police, and it's one of those things where really the jurisdictions are going to cooperate with each other. If there's a major fire or a major shooter event, they're going to work together, and there's typically mutual aid agreements that go into that, so that works. Going into police departments, again, you want police stations that are going to be really across your city. In this game, it reflects how it is in real life, where officers will take, they'll take a certain district. They'll spend most of their time, really patrolling in that district, or whatever the equivalent is. They'll have their own captains to supervise it, but you have your own area that you're primarily patrolling, and then you still respond to call-outs in your district or whatnot. But the key being, you want to have a station that's relatively nearby. There's going to be quite a few people in those areas. All these things that we're talking about, if they're under a local government, county or city, there will typically be funding through taxes. There'll be some things that are funded through grants that will be restricted funds. They can be only used for that purpose. And then you gotta, those departments for those grant funds, they have to actually show requirements that they need to, produce reports to show that they're meeting those requirements. Also with the general fund monies that that can be used for any purpose, well, that ends up being a political decision at the council or board area. So going into levels. So here's the fun zoning aspect of the game, right? Zoning is planning and zoning is critical part of cities and city skylines, I should say. Let me go to, it's been a little while since I've opened this stuff up, but going back there, you have your residential, you have your commercial, offices, and industrial levels. So from a planning perspective, there are multiple things you'd want to consider, right? Traffic impacts are a big deal, and maybe I'll show that right now, right? Traffic flow is going to really be concentrated among certain corridors. For example, off the freeway, look at this red, right? There's a lot of activity. Now, in this game, it's kind of interesting with roundabouts. They're kind of a way to sort through traffic because unless you manually check the actually click the traffic signals in this game, you're not gonna be able to really control traffic from on larger roadways versus smaller ones. So for that reason, they just get clogged up in those lanes. So therefore, roundabouts can be useful. Of course, these types of intersections, these kind of like cloverleaf intersections can be potentially useful anywhere, right? They're just not particularly cheap. They're usually, if they're freeways, they're going to be state funded rather than locally funded, just going through the state legislatures. Meanwhile, your local roads are going to be county and city. That's where your inverse condemnation type claims can come up. Eminent domain comes up so that the government primarily really can build roads so that people have right-of-way access to their homes, to their businesses. It's a whole, complicated process. Doesn't all go to court, but some of it does. And then in terms of any new developments, you want to kind of go through your traffic impacts and make sure that you're considering that, there's going to be a lot of traffic here. Okay, now how do we look at it from a zoning perspective, right? So in this city, I have freeways in various areas so that traffic doesn't just clog up in all these neighborhoods. That's kind of the idea. Going back to, I guess I'll go to pollution before I go back to zoning, but pollution, you can see it's all kind of in the landfill areas, and you're seeing a bit of that with wastewater going downstream, and also with industrial areas. So industrial contaminants are a thing, as I mentioned, and that's why there are regulations that really come out of the Clean Water Act to make sure that, no, there's not too much of a particular mineral and whatnot in your water. So you kind of want to keep that away from where everyone's working and living for the most part. Noise pollution, that's part of the traffic impact, studies that I just mentioned, caused by industry, traffic, certain city services. If there's going to be a lot of, pollution generally, whether it's noise pollution, industrial, whatever, just something to always consider with making planning and zoning decisions at a municipality or a county. Now, let's see. It's been a little while since I've clicked through this stuff. Where was I? With zoning, let me actually show the zoning in this. As they kind of explain what kind of buildings will spawn to the areas next to the roads. There is a method to the madness to how I've done this here. For example, industrial areas are a bit separated out, so they're not really around others based on, pollution based on travel. So the thing I like to do is, one, I have the big freeways that kind of go through, and then what I will do in some more concentrated areas downtown, essentially, I have the higher density residential zones. They're apartments, they build up. Generally, that kind of zoning is a bit more restrictive in your county codes and your city codes, and then you go back to maybe a little less restrictive when it's low density for residential. So I have these homes kind of more in the periphery a little bit than in the middle of town. Same thing of low density, high density commercial zones. With zoning types, there can be dozens of different zoning types, and they have their own particular uses. The key aspect of planning and zoning is you don't want to have everything just build out the way anyone wants to build it out. So you end up having like a farm next to an industrial area and next to. So you're separating them out a little bit so that things kind of make sense where they should be, right? So offices I kind of just have intermixed with commercial and residential because they don't have to be in a particular spot. They're not as loud as maybe a high density commercial zone. And in terms of traffic flow, it just makes sense. If you think about it in terms of how people drive around, right? So people go to work, they come back. Now, they go to work to, they might drive to industrial areas, they may drive to commercial areas to work, they may go to office areas in this game to work. They might also want to go to the commercial areas because they want to buy things, they want to shop and whatnot. The idea being that you have to factor that in when you're building your city in this game, but also that's what local governments think about too. And of course, a more complex manner. Wind turbines in this game, not much to really explain, but there are certain sectors that have more wind. Mentioned pollution. Again, with fire safety and police, it's just a matter of making sure that you have enough resources that go into it. Of course, fire and police departments are very shift work oriented. You want to make sure you have enough officers and firefighters and medical staff, ready for big events. You need a ladder truck if it's going to be you're fighting a fire. You may need, multiple fire trucks. Same thing kind of with police. I mean, you need to be able to send resources when you need them, and you need a certain number of people to do that. For a police department, if they're responding to, a potentially like shooter situation, obviously, but also just, domestic violence, they're going to send more officers. Going into transport, I don't have a lot of public transport options in this game. I don't know if it's very effective, but that's when you go into, bus routes and other types of transit. Transportation projects are generally pretty expensive and pretty time consuming because you got to actually get the land, to do it. So there's going to be a lot of deeds that go forth in terms of transferring land often from private properties. They'll get their just compensation for it, and they get built out really slowly because of the eminent domain process is not a fast one, that's for sure. Going into population, I think, because I don't know, I have a lot to talk about with transportation other than, like, for example, if there's an airport, you got to be worried about any federal guidelines for airports that may apply, including security issues. For buses, it can even be things that are as simple as figuring out bus routes. Again, traffic impact was going to play a bit of a role there as well. Going into outside connections, this is just import-export of products. And I'm not doing a whole lot of industry to begin with here. I'm trying to remember which industry that zone was. I think I just did it as general industrial. And industrial uses in planning and zoning, there are going to be fairly restrictive zones. You can only do certain things in those zones. Going to land value, obviously your downtown areas are going to be a little more expensive than your other areas. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And then resources, again, with local governments, they're going to want to take advantage of what resources they have to create jobs. Because you're not always going to be able to pull, a big fish from, with a lot of money, creating high-paying jobs that spark the economy that the government then has to go through this big development agreement on. That's not always going to be a case. Sometimes you got to take advantage of local resources, and of course those if there's a big industry in town, they're going to have a lot of influence on their local government as well and how it runs. For example, if there's a small town that's not that far from a mine, that mining company's probably going to be pretty involved in how they're going to try to shape how local government works, and there's going to be a little bit of interplay between that industry and that city, and how they reconcile that is a big part of local politics. Districts. So districts are kind of an interesting thing in this game because you can make districts specific to an area where you give them particular benefits. Special taxing districts are a real thing. Now, for these, they're just basically specific to particular industries. And there's tax incentives that are given to those kind of businesses. What are the names of your districts in this? Well, here are the district names, right? We have an oil field, another oil field, industrial, and name one of them Silicon Valley. And there's some other names in here too, as you can see. This one's the university. And then this got hit by a crater, and I just ended up naming it after a crater in Arizona. But that is one of the features of this game where you can actually give tax incentives. But the thing is, it's something that governments have to be pretty careful about. In Arizona, there's something called a gift clause. I'm sure it exists elsewhere as well. Basically, it exists in state constitutions because you don't want taxpayers to just be footing the bill for private interests and there not being a public benefit, to that purpose. I mean, that's what we want and what we expect from taxpayers, or that taxpayers would expect from their governments. So when there are property tax incentives that come into play, there's usually something else. Like they got to bring in a certain amount of economic benefit to their region. Leisure, we're getting into the parks and recreational side of things. People like having places to go where they can hike and walk and bring their dogs and all those things, right? They want places where they can play basketball. So I try to put these as everywhere that I can as well. From a legal perspective, it is just you want to avoid being in a situation where there's liability from someone who walks in the park and then gets hurt. So that's really how that's the local government concern on that side. They want to make sure that they probably, certain places, certain entertainment areas, they want to maybe even take some fees, collect some parking fees, that sort of thing. Fees can only be reasonably related to the actual cost that the government has for the operation. But to go back there, I kind of put everything. I have dog parks in a bunch of places. I have cinemas. You have your attractions and tourism things like cinemas. I even have actually stadiums here, and the stadiums can also create their own special taxing district to collect money for that, building a new stadium and various things too. Not much to say about terrain heights. Let's see. Heating, you want to make sure everything's heated because really it's as much of a public safety issue as anything, public health and safety. Road maintenance is a constant issue, I would say, with city and county governments. You want to make sure that your frequently traveled roads are actually well maintained. It is not a cheap process. Even like street sweeping can be, something that takes quite a bit of resources to do, or like clearing snow. It's certainly depicted in that way in this game as well. Some areas are better maintained than others. And certainly, in certain areas, in real life, right, you're going to have cities with tons of potholes, and they got to be maintained, so. And the other thing with road construction maintenance is taking care of things, making sure that things just don't stay on the road. Like if there's a storm, there's the water is just gonna flow off the road rather than just stay in a pool in the road. That's something that's kind of important with stormwater. Escape routes is Will I start a new city anytime soon? Probably not. Probably not for a little while. Escape routes. This is about disaster prevention. This is one of the DLC in the game. Can I pull up? I'm trying to remember where it was again. So, you know, in this game you can put up disaster response units, you can have helicopters, you can have emergency shelters, radio masts, earthquake sensors, and things like that. So obviously, this is a concern in certain areas. You know, certain local governments are going to be particularly concerned if they, you know, certain areas have flooding issues that can happen, you know, with the floodplains when there's a big storm of the year. So that's always something that governments are also thinking about. It's not just an issue of like New Orleans with their levees, with Hurricane Katrina. Even your smaller departments are going to be thinking, how, if a disaster happens, well, first off, how do we prevent it from being a bad situation? But also, where do people go? Even as simple as, you know, there may be an area that is fairly rural, and there's only one escape route. What if that closes? Is there something we can do with the private property owner to get, you know, create that access? Can we build another road? Can we get some kind of, you know, right-of-way easement from that private property owner for like a public, you know, purpose, right? So generally roads are held in the trust of the public. They're, you know, for example, it may be a county road, but it's really a road held in the trust of the public. Going into let's see, we're into traffic routes.
Say cheese, it's
so,
cheese. We get big
like I mentioned in the game, there, you can actually toggle traffic lights and stop signs and all that.
Full of melted cheese, served steamy
but
and bubbly. It's the bottomless juggler.
It's actually kind of cumbersome in the game as opposed to in real
and our
life.
signature flagship, the spicy blue
Tourism
cheese
is always something that
so hurry in and get them while they last. After all, why take a little
many
bite when you can take
local
a
governments
big bite?
are interested in having,
Dinosaurs.
because
They own
yeah,
a
it's going to bring in
restaurant
some
with a
revenue
service
to the
of
area.
dinosaurs.
It may make
Our
use of something
animatronics are so
historic
real.
that
You think
otherwise
a
wouldn't be
T-Rex is
generating
serving
any
you
money.
T-bone.
Just because something is a
pterodactyl serving you
is a
teriyaki. That a
historic site doesn't
brontosaurus
mean
is
it's.
serving you chili dogs. Every
Oh,
dish
radio.
is an archaeological find, like
Let's
our
listen.
Stegogetti, our Raptor Burger Rex, or the pile of crumbled sticky brownies adventurously named the Dino Droppings. So, take a trip into the wild at Dinosaurus. You can dine in or dine-o.
This is Mars Official Radio with Panamasculine. I aim to please your musical needs.
Okay, dino droppings. Anyway. So tourism, again, you know, you can make use of something that is a historic site or something that is a natural attraction, collect some fees to maintain it. It's kind of par and course with Parks and Recreation, but also some things are not quite in that vein, you know, but also bring in money in a different way, bring in business, bring in, you know, incentivizes restaurants to move in that area, that sort of thing. Let me see what else I can cover. Well, thank you. I'm trying to think, this may actually be a good stopping point anyway.